guys. Welcome back to the 706 podcast. I'm your host for this week, Tony. I am joined by my three friends who may now introduce themselves in the following. We'll go alphabetical order. That seems very nice and clean. Let's go Anthony, Connor, and Kirk.
Anthony.
I am Connor.
Hey folks, my name is Kirk, and I am an avid Tarantino fan. Excited to get this one rolling. Take it away, Tony.
Thank you very much, Kirk. I am also a big Tarantino fan. This week we're doing Jackie Brown, which is our first Tarantino directed film. Early in the podcast, we did True Romance, which was written by Tarantino, directed by Tony Scott. So this is our first kind of true blue Tarantino movie. I'm very excited to get started, and I'll do a quick introduction about what the movie is, and then I'll let you guys say your kind of first impressions, or I guess second impressions in the case of some of you. So Jackie Brown is 1997 crime drama by Quentin Tarantino. This is his follow-up to Pulp Fiction. Obviously, Pulp Fiction is his, probably to this date, his most popular, most iconic film. It's the one people think of when they think of Tarantino, and it's the one that kind of blew him up. It won the Palme d'Or at Cannes. It was a huge box office smash, making over many times its budget back. I think it was like an $8 million movie, and it made over $200 million at the box office. So, and it was a huge critical hit, huge commercial hit, sparked just a slew of imitators at every Sundance Film Festival for the rest of the 90s. One of the most influential films of the past, 30 or so years. And then several years later, he comes out with Jackie Brown, which was, while also well-reviewed and commercially successful, nowhere near the smash that Pulp Fiction was. A much more modest hit. It made $80 million, and while it got pretty good reviews, or certainly respectful reviews, it didn't kind of catch the world on fire in the same way that Pulp Fiction did. And even to this day, it remains a movie that is not regarded as one of his most iconic. People have the Pulp Fiction poster in their dorms, maybe an Inglourious Bastards poster or Kill Bill. They don't have Jackie Brown posters generally, although of late there's been kind of a resurgence, or more of it's kind of made something of a comeback. So Jackie Brown, our title character, played by Pam Grier, is an airline stewardess who is running money for an illegal gun dealer played by Samuel L. Jackson from Mexico to Los Angeles, kind of in bits and pieces. And this is the extent of her involvement in his organization. And eventually she gets arrested, she gets questioned, and we begin sort of a game where you have Samuel L. Jackson's character Ordell on one side, the feds from the ATF on the other side, and Jackie Brown in the middle, kind of playing both sides against each other, trying to find an angle, trying to find an escape from this unfortunate situation. All right, so that's my introduction. So without further ado, I believe Kirk is the one who has never seen this before. So I'm going to start it with Kirk.
Thanks, Tony. And that was quite a comprehensive intro. So yeah, like I said, avid Tarantino fan. I think we might have mentioned this last episode, but it's so evident on the screen that he's such a fan of movies, of the medium itself, right? Like he's really, passionate about making something that he would enjoy watching, just on a first watch. And so I appreciate his kind of attention to the perspective of the audience and, how that can vary. So this is a great film, I think. I think it's worthy of being mentioned in the first breath with his other works. I wouldn't say I'd knock it down below anything. Truth be told, I think Pulp Fiction's a little bit overrated. I find Jackie Brown to have a more cohesive structure. The narrative is a little more solid. I think it felt, kind of like a response to something. I don't know what, I'm not knowledgeable to know what he's satirizing necessarily in this film and what he's referencing, what he's calling out. I know Pam Grier was in a movie called Foxy Brown. I'm sure there's definitely some callbacks to that, right? Something for the audience, like a couple winks, right? And that's kind of his signature there is, how he can play with movie history and how he can iterate upon past ideas, even his own. But I think the performances are so stellar. Like Pam Grier is just excellent. She's so good. And I don't know if that's a product of how the character was written, but I think it's a little of both. But it's just even in 2021, right? Like 24 years later, it still feels refreshing to see this character on the screen. Samuel L. Jackson is as vicious and as cunning and ruthless and dastardly as he always is. Like he's so perfect in this film. I think it is in the running for one of his best performances ever, really. To me, he's just so perfect for the role. It's fun to see De Niro in a position where he's just this ancillary character who kind of is just there along for the ride with us. And there's something to be said as to how he's used and to what end, right? I really appreciate that. But this film, I think I will enjoy it on subsequent watches because it's one of those where, everybody's trying to play each other, and it's, it almost turns into a farce at some point. It's just, you're deep in this plot to kind of everybody's double crossing and triple crossing each other, and you're trying to figure out, oh, how's she going to escape the situation? Who's she playing? Who's she telling it straight to? I really liked Robert Forster's character. I think he was a crucial ingredient. He's like, this movie deals a lot with race, issues of gender, and kind of the intersectional balance between those two. We have a strong Black male in this film who, by this point in cinema history, we're used to seeing on the screen, right? We're used to seeing strong Black leads, not enough, admittedly so, but we're used to seeing some. This is a film that Tarantino really wanted to present a strong female Black character who kind of flew in the face of all of the stereotypes and derogatory mischaracterizations that are levied towards Black women. So, the idea that Black women are highly emotional or aspersions cast towards their body, the control over their body, all these horrible stereotypes that have perpetuated in American society. We see a character who doesn't bend under pressure, who doesn't self-sabotage or whatever, it's so refreshing. But then we have the juxtaposition with, I think her name is Sharonda. She's a crack addict. That's, I think, a deliberate nod to like the classic archetype that we know in cinema of the Black woman. And also Jackie Brown's not a mother, so very motherly, right? Like that's another role that Black women were slotted into throughout the last century. But I will just say that in wrapping up, that it was fun. It was a fun ride. There's some really memorable moments, some really memorable scenes and lines. It's hard to kind of characterize this film. Like there's a lot of comedy in here. And so that makes it pulls away at the suspense element a little bit. Like you never really fear for anybody. You never really relate to anybody on a visceral level. And you're just kind of viewing it from afar as this kind of objective observer. And you're never really lied to as the audience as well. So it's kind of a little more detached than some of his other works. Like, for instance, like Hateful Eight, like you're really thrown into that. I didn't feel that way coming out of Jackie Brown. And I don't know if that's good or bad. I just think it's a craftful, well-made, the soundtrack's amazing, right? The theming, just the general motifs throughout the film are amazing. Seeing this side of LA, right? Like Carson, Torrance, Hawthorne, all these places, really cool. Hermosa Beach. Yeah, big fan. And I'll stop there.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Kirk. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I know Connor and Anthony have seen it before. Why don't we do Anthony next?
I love the strategic order, I guess, of going first or giving initial thoughts. But I think one thing to start off is, I had seen this before, but it's been years. I think it was freshman year of college is when I first saw this, or maybe just before that, in the early start. So I hadn't seen it since then. And Tony's point last week about how there's kind of a consensus, or at least an undercurrent, particularly online, of people who are adamant that this may be the sort of definitive or best Tarantino film for a myriad of reasons. Sort of the argument of, a band's lesser album is really their best type attitude. And if you asked me back then, I might have agreed with that. Actually, this would be the period just after Django Unchained, pre Hateful Eight, and of course pre Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. But rewatching it now for the first time since then, I wouldn't say that now. I wouldn't say this is his best film. I wouldn't even say it's maybe in his top 2 or 3 of the 9 that we currently have. I think it's a good movie. I do think it has issues in terms of its own filmic pacing. There are times personally when I feel kind of like it could use an edit. There are times when I feel the pacing could actually help the audience, which is hilarious to me because, of course, like even for a movie like Hateful Eight, which I don't really care for, the pacing of that movie really sweeps me in a way that you were talking about, Kirk. Whereas this one, sometimes I honestly kind of lose myself. I drift away and I have to like be like, oh yeah, where were we? But everything else, of course, has so much going for it. The performances, Pam Grier, the legend, of course, has a great performance. As you talked about, Kirk, Robert Forster, who I really honestly didn't know outside of seeing him much later in Twin Peaks: The Return and really liking him in that role. But here he's great. And I think, of course, as you also said, Kirk, that one of the smartest decisions is casting Robert De Niro as a sort of subdued kind of guy, kind of more relaxed than we're ever used to, particularly at this point of time. I mean, now it's kind of a joke of, I guess, how Robert De Niro's and everything, but still in the 90s, there's still some sort of aura to him. And I think expecting a sort of moment where he's going to like let loose or something, which never really happens. Yeah, he does kill and shoot Bridget Fonda's character, but there's not like that grand speech that you're used to for De Niro, which I think is a smart, interesting play. And one other thing I find really fascinating about this movie, and fascinating for Tarantino overall, is it's the last time he's filming something in like the sense of the present. Because after this movie, like Kill Bill's sort of operating in a fantasy space to me. I mean, I don't know how you would put that on a timeline, but like everything after that, he's going back into history and he's revising it, he's changing it or whatever, But here, it still feels like a capsule, like the mall. Like the fact that like they could have this whole sequence take place in the mall, like dates the film in an interesting kind of artful way. And of course, that brings us to one other point I want to talk about, which we may get into later, is it's the one film that I know of that Tarantino adapts from his hero, Elmer Leonard, which I find interesting because I would think that would take care of some of the problems I have with his films. But at the end of the day, it's sometimes, like I said earlier, feels too expansive at points. But overall, great characters, of course, the classic Tarantino dialogue. And yeah, no, I'll kind of leave it there. I think I'm solid on this movie, though, to start off the conversation.
All right. Thank you, Anthony. And we'll close off with Connor.
Frankly, I'm getting stage fright because I've been waiting for this moment for so long to be able to talk about Jackie Brown on the podcast, because it was one of the movies that at first, kind of got me into film. I know I've said that for a couple movies, but this was definitely a big part of my like film awakening. I had seen Kill Bill volumes 1 and 2. But this was a movie where I saw like a part of it on cable. I'm like, this isn't quite as cool as Kill Bill. Like, why is he doing this? Where's the action? Yeah, but then finding myself that I could still be gripped by that dialogue that I recalled from Kill Bill, and in that just incredibly sharp writing, and finding this feeling of fondness for this character of Jackie Brown, which is something I never had before. I never related to a character, in that way before. And it itself, the theme song of the film, which itself comes from, it was a film theme, across 110th Street. I was blasting that on YouTube for the next, like a couple weeks after I watched it, and it got me into older film. And of course, I revisited some of Pam Grier's films, and Coffee, I think, is her big breakout and my favorite of those roles that she did in the early 70s. But I'm stalling because it's like there's so much to say about this. I think I like what Kirk said, the idea of coherence. And that may be due to, as Anthony points out, right, the fact that it's an adaptation. This is unique in his oeuvre. And I would agree that, as Anthony mentioned, it's the last of his kind of modern day movies. It's also, at the same time, I mean, not the last, because Kill Bill also takes place in the modern day, but it's not this comic book reality that I think you also see in Pulp Fiction to some extent. You see in Reservoir Dogs to some extent. This is a movie that feels so much more grounded and human and true to our lived experience. There are some kind of heightened moments, of course, but the characters can feel like real people, and their concerns are our daily concerns. And yes, there's this element of this heightened crime aspect, but even that is kind of played down. None of these characters are particularly, even Ordell, he kind of builds the myth of himself as this arms dealer when really he is kind of rather a petty criminal with some success, But everything feels so down to earth, and the characters feel so down to earth, and the writing feels so human. And again, this is such an interesting choice. It's as if, I feel like when I'm watching this movie, it feels somehow so not only coherent, but mature to me when you compare it to his other movies, which revel in that, what Kirk was describing, this kind of postmodern mashup remix, Tarantino is often compared to the zeitgeist of remixes in hip hop and stuff. This is a movie that blends its influences and is very subtle in what it does. And I mean, it's in terms of genre, this doesn't feel like a genre film. I mean, it adheres to kind of a modern dramatic sort of genre conventions, while also playing with simple kind of hints of references to older film. And it has this kind of nostalgia that we see in other Tarantino movies, but in this transformed way. Had you first heard about this movie, you would think, oh, this is going to be a kind of movie in the style of Coffee or Foxy Brown, which are these hyper-violent, kind of hyper-sexual blaxploitation films that involve putting Pam Grier into all of these kind of gruesome, awful situations. Of course, she kicks ass and finds her way out of it. But there's something so very special to me that he takes this actress whom he admired, when he was a kid, coming up watching movies, and gives her the kind of role that he felt that she never got and that she deserved, which is this mature woman who is so fascinating and so confident and so just lovely as a person. She has her flaws too. And to let her have this kind of triumph and also not to expose her to these kind of indignities. There's the threat of these indignities, but she always keeps her dignity intact in any of these moments. And the fact too that it avoids kind of sexualizing her. She's a beautiful woman, and that's part of it, but she has so many aspects to her. And, finally, there's this kind of chastity to the only real contact we have between Max Cherry and Jackie Brown is that single, simple, kiss or two kisses at the end of the film. And it's so incredibly moving to me. And there's something so mature and restrained in that it really takes my breath away. And it's almost as if I sometimes wonder whether somehow the Tarantino who made Jackie Brown is somehow a time traveler from the future. That somehow Tarantino came back from today when he's himself in his 50s, is kind of more mature, a little bit less into the showy, postmodern pastiche stuff, and is kind of coming back to make this film with all of this wisdom and kind of resisting the urge simply to quote and to cite and to remix, and to create this truly touching modern film that's so down to earth and so raw and so, maybe not raw, but truly touching on a human level. Anyway, I'm amazed by it, and I would compare it. I think if anything, if we can compare it to anything, it reminds me of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Again, that tenderness, that willingness to revise the past, that simple kind of nostalgic feeling that we get when Jackie Brown and Max Cherry are listening to the Delphonics. It's that kind of note. It's that kind of tender Tarantino that we don't see elsewhere. And while it's not necessarily representative, and I would still think of other movies that are more purely Tarantino, I have to say, I love this movie, and it's such an interesting piece of his filmography. So I have nothing really negative to say, though I think Anthony may have some points there, but that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, Connor, real quick, would you consider this then your favorite Tarantino?
Sorry, I had to vape for a second after my long speech, but I would not call it my favorite. I couldn't call it my favorite. Hard to choose a favorite.
Okay.
My kind of contrarian pick might be Hateful Eight, which I would defend against its detractors. But that's kind of just to sound interesting. I think my favorite, and what I think is his greatest, is Inglourious Bastards.
Okay.
and maybe personal favorite Kill Bill Volume 2, as I discussed last time. But hard to choose. So hard.
You got the monocle dropper, the sentimental favorite, and then the actual favorite. Okay, I see. That's good. That's
Right,
you got to have three. You got to have three. I agree.
We all know it's Death Proof, Connor. Just say it.
There are people who
And that
say
one
that.
I haven't
Kirk.
revisited in a long time.
I need to watch it again. Yeah. Okay. Well, you guys made a lot of great points, and I kind of anticipated a lot of my own points about this movie. I think the key word Connor used is maturity or mature, because yes, in a way that does feel almost like, even to date, his most mature film, I feel like. And it is weird to think that this guy made this movie at that particular moment in his career, coming off of, not to, harp on this over and over again, but coming off of Pulp Fiction. It's interesting that he went in this direction of kind of pulling back a little bit, of restraining himself, not in terms of length, because this is a 2.5 hour movie. This is a fairly long movie, as Anthony said, but in terms of the postmodern touches, the non-chronological narratives, the references, the really showy kind of almost French New Wave touches, all that stuff he kind of puts to the side, and kind of gives us something a little more meat and potatoes. But the key thing, though, is that I feel like if I were like in high school when this came out and I'd seen Pulp Fiction and I were looking forward to this movie and watching it, I might be a little disappointed because it would be boring. Maybe I'm not saying that, and I haven't heard anyone say that, but like I could see someone feeling that way if they're expecting a Reservoir Dogs or Pulp Fiction and getting this, because it really does rein back on those things. And the other thing that I noticed too on this watch is how restrained he is with the violence. Like Tarantino is known for his use of violence, perhaps above all else. Maybe not above all else, but it's one of the first things he'll say about him is like, oh, he loves violence. And he'd say this himself. I love putting violence in my movies. You see people like in Django Unchained, when someone gets shot, they explode like a balloon filled with blood, and every one of those movies has something like that, some really over the top gratuitous violence. In this movie, most of the violence is off screen. And I think he's kind of making a statement and setting the tone for the whole movie with the first death in the movie, which is Beaumont, when we get that really long shot of that dirt. I don't know if it's a junkyard or what it is. It's some like abandoned, like vacant lot. You see the car stop. Samuel L. Jackson walks out, puts two shots into the trunk, and you just hear Beaumont stop talking, which is very restrained. And that's not a death. I don't think we really see a death like that in any of his earlier movies. And there are on-screen deaths in this movie, but I don't know if we ever see a death on camera. I think like even later in the film when Robert
De Niro gets shot on camera,
okay,
and there's a squib.
De Niro's the one exception, but he has his back to us, so we see the blood spatter on the windshield, but we don't necessarily see the wound. So yeah, so there is technically some on-screen violence, but it is far less and far more restrained than we typically see in a Tarantino movie. And I'd say that most of these deaths occur off screen. We might see the aftermath for a short bit, but it is much more restrained and feels much more realistic, and less movie-ish than other Tarantino violence. And the other thing that Anthony pointed out that I really delight in this movie is its sense of being contemporary of its time, being in the present day. Because even the movies that are ostensibly set in the present day are in, as Connor said, a heightened comic book version of reality. Pulp Fiction does not feel like 1994. It's just Kill Bill doesn't feel like 2003 or 2004 or whatever. This movie feels like it's very clearly set in 1995, which is when the story takes place, particularly with the airport and the mall. I love how much time we spend in this mall, placing it so squarely in the present, which can't not be a deliberate choice. This had to be a thing that he put thought into and did on purpose. And I think the purpose it serves in this story, which is about getting older, right? All these characters are getting older, facing their mortality, facing what it means to get older, and how does that impact your life? How does that impact your decisions? The sense of place and time is very deliberate because it's contrasted with the 70s music choices and the font choices in the opening credits and the casting of Pam Grier and Robert De Niro. There's a ton of 70s nostalgia going on in this movie. And I think nostalgia is one of the real through lines throughout Tarantino's career. So this movie's kind of about nostalgia. It's about him being a kid, watching TV in the 70s, seeing Pam Grier, watching these, kung fu shows, going to the movies, feeling that wistfulness that you feel, and being an adult and thinking back on that feeling, thinking on the the way that adulthood forces choices on you maybe weren't ready for, or, you start to see doors close, all those things. And I think that tension between the banality of the setting, the everydayness of the setting, and these beautiful songs that convey that feeling of romance and wistfulness. And I think the casting of Pam Grier as well, and just sort of putting her in this more grounded setting, giving her more of an actual character to play, giving her that dignity and that humanity. But I just love this movie. I think it's full of texture. I think it's full of life. I think that every scene pops. I can't quite agree with Anthony about the pacing, because I think it flies by for me. And every scene is just so filled with detail and moments of just fun that I just enjoy watching this movie so much. An early scene in the movie where Samuel L. Jackson is luring Beaumont out of the apartment is in like one of the best sequences I think Tarantino's ever directed. I absolutely love that scene from beginning to end. It's one of my favorite scenes ever. Just the dialogue, the way it builds, the way he has to convince him to come out. It's a perfect scene, all culminating in his death, as I mentioned, is just great. And lastly, I think that Robert De Niro too. I love Robert De Niro in this role, playing one of the most pathetic and repugnant characters he's ever really played, subverting our expectations here, when that we're expecting, Robert De Niro to give a big speech or to have a really badass moment brandishing a gun, but he's just a pathetic, really sad character. The way he can't even hang up the phone right. I mean, just great. So anyway, there's so much in this movie. This movie creates an entire world. So I love it a lot, and I'm glad you guys mostly enjoyed it. But let's start, I guess, with the theme of time, or the distance, the nostalgia, the time, the setting. I mean, Anthony alluded to it a little bit with the talk comment about the mall. Like, what did you see in this movie, Anthony, about that, or about time, and what do you think is its function, or what do you think it's really doing?
Sure. Well, one thing I wanted to point out before I forget is just real quick about the question of like Tarantino doing this after Pulp Fiction, is not counting for inflation or anything. It's still like it makes 75 million like worldwide, I think, which is, or maybe it's US, I'd have to recheck it, but either way, from the list I saw, it's still a higher grosser than the Grindhouse movies and the Hateful Eight, technically, at least in like a US sense. I'd have to double check that, but I wanted to point that out because I find that very curious how this movie becomes like a moderate, like kind of box office, like little success. I feel like it wouldn't happen now to that extent. But anyway, my point was about time is one thing that interests me, I guess, is, this talk of Connor's term, which I love, the comic book fantasy or comic book setting type world of his other movies. And the startling difference here with Jackie Brown, which was that normally when we think of Tarantino, we do think of the violence, but we also think of the kind of standard touchstones, partly because of him brandishing them out so much, which is like Godard, the French New Wave influence, and things like Pulp Fiction, and on, and his editing and his pacing. And we get a little bit of that here when like Pam Grier's in the kitchen, but it's not quite the same frenetic pace of a Breathless or something. But we also usually think of like a Sergio Leone and that kind of sense of violence, the cartoon blood in Kill Bill that feels so out of that kind of revisionist Western or acid Western. And we also think maybe of kind of like the Pauline Kael and sort of the other kind of atmospheric change of like looking back for Tarantino. But this movie, or sorry, the Hong Kong movies is what I was thinking of, like the kind of John Woo that he's always talking about, with an obvious touchstone for Reservoir Dogs. But with Jackie Brown, you really get the sense he's also really playing with film noir and kind of noir-esque moments. Like you almost, I'm curious how much of like something like an early Michael Mann seems to almost sort of like run underground of this film. And when he's thinking about like the moment of time, you get the kind of like Coen brothers sense of small scale crime happening, because like one of the things I love about this is we never really get the motive for selling the guns. Like you could imply, I guess, a sort of Mexico drug cartel violence or anything, but everything seems so small scale. It's $500,000 thereafter, which I looked into, and I have this problem with movies, the inflation calculator, which is less than $1 million today, which sounds like such great money for a sort of Pam Grier person who's stuck in a $16,000 job with nowhere to go. And of course, as we know, like just historically, a job like that's going to vanish within a few years. And I'm kind of running into all these different tangents, but it's one of those unique things I think of him capturing this moment so specifically well in time with these kind of Elmer Leonard film noir tropes means that we get like a vision of what a working life for this kind of Black woman is so well. And I don't think like this person could exist in the same way in any other setting, but because he's able to turn that background into such a successful character, it really does so much for the movie. So I don't know if I really answered that, but I was all over the place.
No, that is interesting. Yeah, no, it is interesting how this movie is, its presentness, kind of the time it was made is the only time in which this exact story could play out in this exact way, right? Which is always true to some degree, but I think in this particular case, definitely. I don't know. What did you think about that, Kirk? Did that resonate with you at all, or what did you see in this setting or in this character, or you mentioned the racial and gender dynamics, which is always interesting when you watch a movie from like the 90s, for instance, because the way you see these things depicted in modern films is pretty different, I think, from the 90s. But obviously the 90s is, not that long ago. So what was your takeaway with regard to those elements, or what did you think this movie really had to say about race and gender in 1997 or in general?
Thank you, Tony. And you see, Tony he's a great host. He knows how to play into my strengths. Okay. I'm a social worker for those listening at home. So I know how to talk about gender and race relations in America. French New Wave, not so much. I'm the simpleton of the crew anyways. But I did notice some anachronisms throughout the film. I don't know if it was distinctly placed in 1997, like 1995, like maybe it's because we're so far removed that these things blend in, right? Like the mall definitely felt very dated. I guess it might be a good place to plan a handoff nowadays because they're just so empty. But the mall is such a dated concept, and I was thinking more and more about some of the shots, and I just want to mention sometimes it can feel a little indulgent to mention specific shots you liked, but they're just things I want to kind of reinforce for myself, like Beaumont's killing. I mean, that shot, the car drives away and then it pulls back in kind of an alleyway in a deserted lot on the next block. I mean, that's so perfect. And then he drives away again after he shoots him on a single shot. And then I was also really taken aback by the towards the end of the film, Ordell is on the phone with Max, I think is Max Sherry, right? And he's saying, and I will walk hand in handcuffed motherfucking hand with Jackie to Pelican Bay or whatever. And it's just like this slowly creeping in shot of the back of Samuel L. Jackson's head, which he has a very distinct hairstyle in this film, but illuminated by this ambient light from a TV. And it's just perfect. That shot is so good. Like, my God, just when you combine with what's being said, right? And how still and calm and perfectly under control he is in that moment, having just been scammed out of $500,000. But anyways, back to gender and race. I think this would be oh God, I can't remember. OJ was 97, so I mean, this was certainly there were developments happening in the LA area. You had Rodney King earlier, and then the riots. That's one word for it. Protests, and there's a lot of mistrust of the police, and that was the thing that white America didn't understand about the OJ trial, is just how brutally and systemically corrupt the police force, at least in LA County, was like, and how it was not beyond the realm of imagination to believe that OJ had been framed. Like, that was really something to behold, and something that white America could not possibly comprehend, and still can't really, if you ask people about OJ. But I just, part of me wonders, like, coming at it from this kind of ultra modern, perspective, and I don't think we're ultra modern, but like this present moment when we look at, we want to not necessarily hand the microphone over and kind of, or we don't want to amplify someone's voice through our own voice, right? We want them to be able to speak for themselves. So I think that's what a lot of folks might say, is that this may feel, and I'm just, I'm pontificating here about the feelings that some people might have viewing it from this modern lens, that it's a little patronizing in a way. This white man kind of presenting this very provocative and challenging these norms. But I think it's important, because obviously we live in an imperfect world, and we can't have representation be endogenous at all times. Like, we're talking about an industry that is highly racialized and sexist. And so we have to kind of work within the parameters that we have. And I think this is an important film for that era for those reasons. And, I think Tarantino kind of carries this forward when you look at Django, when you look at Inglourious Bastards. He got some flack for Django because it was kind of like taken to the extreme. It was even as a white man, like I kind of had these feelings like this feels a little bit, I don't know, extra. Like what's the right word for it? This feels a little bit patronizing.
Do you mean like he's trying too hard to like
a concession? Yeah, like this feels like
look at him killing all these white people. Don't you like me? Like,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Like rampant white guilt almost, right? Wow. Like, and that's kind of in its own way is kind of can arouse some disgust. So, but I think it's really great. And one thing I will say is like Melanie is very purposefully, she's like this sleazy, like licentious, indolent character who's like, that character had been played by Black women so often, right? It's kind of like they use like weed instead of crack or whatever, but like someone who's just, she has sex on order, right? Like, she uses her body as a transaction, and she's engaging in all these hedonistic endeavors, and and short-tempered and kind of volatile and petulant, almost like childlike. And so I think that was a nice little subversion to have that mix there. You have kind of De Niro, and you have her, the two white kind of side characters there. And then you have the two actually ambitious, smart, cunning in their own way. You have Pam Grier and Samuel L. Jackson. So, as a white man, right, like this is my perspective. I think this was kind of a really cool film to see these inversions play out. But, I just wanted to say one more thing, because, I don't need to talk until the end, basically, but I've said most of what I need to say. But I just appreciate, and I think everybody else has kind of said it, like how this film doesn't, Tarantino sometimes, and the Coen brothers as well, is like this need to like throw these entropic situations at us and just kind of let us pick up the pieces. I like how this story has this has an ending that feels satisfactory. Like it doesn't feel like we're left in a room with 10 dead bodies and we kind of have to understand what happened, right? It's like I don't know, there's some overlap, I guess, that I'm lazily making with Coen brothers, like No Country for Old Men or Fargo or Burn After Reading. I guess they're more guilty of it than Tarantino is, but there are still moments in Tarantino films where it's like, oh well, that just happened, and then the film ends. So this one felt a little more congealed, which is my style personally. That's what I enjoy in a film. I like a film to have a solid ending for me to take away. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely a solid narrative with a beginning, middle, and end. Very classically sound. Also, guys, you now know that Kirk is in fact a white man. To all our listeners, I will not disclose my race or gender at this time. Maybe in the 100th episode face reveal, you will find out. But anyway, Connor, do you have any notes on some of those topics or on some of the? We started kind of with temporality, and then we transitioned to kind of these issues of race and gender in this film. So it was pretty scattered, I know. But did anything on those topics come out to you or like really resonate with you?
Sure. I mean, the Race and Gender stuff is really interesting. I'm trying to think of what more I can say that Kirk hasn't pointed out, the way in which these roles are all interesting. I think there's still something about, yeah, that OJ Simpson era time and the fact that we have this kind of understated, kind of white, it's my jab, that kind of guy. He becomes the hero, So there's something a little bit like weird, kind of strange about that, that you could suspect in a way. I think he pulls it off, and I think I still respect it too. There's the fact that Ordell is killed, like he has a gun and is immediately shot, obviously, and it's like, there's something a little bit problematic about that in its own way. I think the movie is able to recognize the conflicts and the contradictions there. But there's more to delve into. I don't feel quite equipped to go there, but I think on the level of like temporality, level of time, I think this movie is interesting. Okay, because I'll say something that you've heard me say a lot. This idea of the 90s as the end of history. Fukuyama didn't quite say it, but he mentioned it in his paper. So we say that he said it was the end of history. He was wrong or whatever he himself admitted. Anyway, but the idea, the notion, okay, of the 90s is the end of the Cold War, beginning of neoliberal hegemony, the sense that this will be the way the world is forever, kind of consumerism and a kind of pastiche and mishmash of culture. There will never be another 80s. There'll never be another 60s or 70s. There'll never be another decade, a cultural moment again, right? There'll never be another zeitgeist. It's just going to be this kind of amorphous agglomeration of postmodern influences and things that never quite fit together. Of course, Tarantino working in the 90s seems to kind of trumpet the spirit of kind of the element of these kind of mishmash, these ill-fitted pieces that we've kind of put together to form meaning out of life. And that would be the case of, I think the best example, honestly, to express this, zeitgeist would be True Romance, which he wrote, where we have this nerd character who, by watching Sonny Chiba movies and idolizing Elvis, he kind of finds the impetus to kind of do something heightened, comic bookish in his own life, to take bold steps. And it's a story of love and courage and all this. That I think is a common kind of sentiment that you'll see in movies at the time. And I think it's an idea that Tarantino has as well, that maybe in this pop cultural material that surrounds us, in this consumerist hodgepodge of a society that we live in, we can find, meaning in these, pop cultural products and create a narrative for ourselves and this kind of thing. What's interesting about this movie is that it seems to resist that urge, in that when we find people watching TV, there's very much a sense of kind of the ugliness, the boringness of TV, the way we just kind of put it on to avoid thinking about anything else. I think it's more pessimistic about consumption of culture. Well, think too of like a moment where like Max Cherry meets Jackie Brown by mistake, right? Or just by coincidence in the mall. And she says, hey, like, I was just watching a movie. Like, what'd you see? In another Tarantino movie, you'd think he would go into what movie he saw and we'd like read into that or something, like it would mean something, but he just avoids it. Just who cares what he was seeing? He consumes media like any of us do. The most positive moment, and it's a very cute moment, right? They have the moment where they're listening to the Delphonics in Jackie's apartment. And then later, we see Max Cherry picking out the Delphonics tapes in the store, this simple idea of finding meaning in art or consumer, sort of media content, right? That I think we all can relate to and is kind of our modern condition. So it has, but overall, I think it believes much more in real life and in real people than it does in like art necessarily, though it has, of course, it itself is art and it can give us meaning in all of this. But I find that curious about it. But I think that is kind of the zeitgeist. And it's interesting. He takes a kind of, I think, a slightly more pessimistic view in this, but I think it still very much adheres to its time and, fits into that end of history, postmodern, feeling of the mid 90s.
Yeah, it's a lot of great context there. I do agree about the idea of these cultural products being presented in a much more kind of negative way, with the obvious exception of the Delphonics and the use of the 70s music. But yeah, the television scenes, of course, are, very drab and negative. And I think that idea of kind of subverting our expectations in that way, or taking what we want to see and kind of throwing it in our face is really embodied in Robert De Niro, who is in that scene with Melanie watching TV. You know, they have sex, and of course, you know, Melanie is very sexualized. She's always wearing like a bikini top and like jean shorts. She's this very beautiful woman, and so it's sort of like, hey, don't you want to see them have sex? And it's the most, you know, anticlimactic, really like kind of gross, off-putting scene. You see them from the waist up, they're fully clothed, and they just kind of grunts and thrusts, and they say like, yeah, that was fun. And then, you know, the other thing with Robert De Niro is we're waiting for him to be like a badass. We're waiting for him to have the bad, like, oh, there's going to be Robert De Niro in a Tarantino movie. Cool. And you're waiting for him to have his badass moment. And his badass moment is him like yelling and beating a woman in a parking lot in this really like awful, like cringe inducing way. Like there's no mistake that like no one who watches this movie could be like, oh, how horrible that it depicts violence against women in this way. It's very clearly in a very unflattering and like ugly way. I'm not sure if that 100% ties into what Connor was saying, but it did remind me of that sort of the subverting our expectations, or kind of like taking something that you thought was going to go one way and kind of inverting it in a way that has to be intentional. I do think these things are perhaps on his mind when he was putting this together. And the other thing too was Kirk was saying on the notes of like kind of the racial commentary. I mean, we don't have to go on it for a really long time, but like I think it's super interesting and layered in this movie. Like Jackie's characterization in the way that like I feel like what this movie does so successfully is it treats her race and her gender as facts about the world and things that do add a level of precarity to her situation. And the film acknowledges those kind of social dynamics without ever letting those facts about her define her character. She's not defined by being a Black woman. She is a character who happens to be a Black woman and faces additional obstacles because of that. And the only time, maybe not the only time, but one of the few times it's explicitly mentioned in this way is in this first scene where she's being interrogated by the ATF, and the cop, who's not Michael Keaton, I don't know the other guy, unfortunately, but he says, I would think that if I were a middle-aged Black woman, I wouldn't want to give up the one little job I was fortunate enough to get, it's such an amazing line, because it's like, on the one hand, it's like, oh, wow, this guy's kind of woke. He understands the added pressure she faces. But on the other hand, it's like, it's not woke at all, because he's weaponizing her identity against her. He's saying, hey, we have more power over you. You have more to lose. So you have to do what we say. And while this movie isn't like, I wouldn't say it's go so far as to say it's like anti-cop or like about the Rodney King situation or whatever, it does paint a pretty cynical view of law enforcement, and that them and Ordell, who are both trying to get what they want out of Jackie Brown, are basically, they're using leverage. They're using the power to bluster and inspire fear in this person to get what they want. And it shows that how both the institutions of like the federal government, law enforcement, what have you, authority, the man, will use whatever leverage he can get to get what he wants out of you and doesn't care about you. And Ordell, the criminal, the villain in the story, is doing the same thing. You know, he's leveraging threats of violence against people to get what he wants in this incredibly ruthless way. So there is kind of an interesting dichotomy between these two institutions, these two characters or whatever. But yeah, I mean, we've been going for a little while. I think what we could do now is maybe go into the voting and everyone kind of the last word, kind of summarize their thoughts, or maybe introduce something that was maybe on their mind that they just thought of or whatever. So why don't we start let's start voting with Kirk. Let's just go in the order we went at the beginning.
All right. So yeah, it's a yes for me. I will just say, I think might have been Connor, but Tony touched on it too. Just the idea, you know, for me, Tarantino's best moments are when he tunes into these very human moments and scenarios. Like he tunes into the emotion that attends these outrageous or vicious or beautiful or boring or whatever mundane moments. And that final scene is very touching with the close-up of the kiss, a very human kiss, a very human embrace. I thought it was beautiful. And, you know, there's part of me that's like, you know, what could have been, right, with Tarantino, this, you know, kind of consequentialist perspective, like where could we have been and what have we missed But I think that's a selfish interpretation. I think we can appreciate what we have, and this film for me is high up there for sure. I think it would be only fair to view every Tarantino film multiple times before giving it like a true score, just because of the things you miss. But I think I can safely place this in the top echelon for me of his canon. I will say yes. I mean, easily it cracks this 706 greatest films. It's pretty easily cracks that bar. So good job,
All right.
Tony.
And your favorite line? You got to throw in the favorite line.
Favorite line. You probably is that a 45 pointed at my dick? I think that was a pretty good line. Maybe it was a 9mm. He was not a fan of the 45. They have jamming problems.
Well, that was also Max Cherry's gun, so maybe he's one of the guys. Yeah. Anyway,
yeah.
Anthony, you go.
Sure. Let me apologize for misreading the box office information in the beginning. This is actually his third least successful film from the box office standpoint. The only two that were worse was his Death Proof and Reservoir Dogs in its initial run, which begs the question of the more fanciful, violent Tarantino is almost wanting to perhaps resurrect that sort of box office success, maybe. I mean, it's a hypothetical. We'll never know for sure, but maybe we lost, as Kirk was speculating, a sort of more human or grounded Tarantino along the way, or maybe one less willing to do that. Although, we could play on that thematically in his other films. But final thoughts before I vote, just quickly, is about the sort of racial things. I think one line that I'm surprised no one brought up is really fascinating is when Odell is leading Beaumont out before he tells him to go into the trunk. He tells him that they're going to go sell some guns to the Koreans because they're still scared, which for anyone who knows anything about LA and the Rodney King story knows one of the most circulated videos of the time was a sort of guerrilla-like warfare being fought between largely painted as Korean and Japanese store owners with guns who were adamantly shooting and fearful against what they call black men in a number of different interviews, which seems like a line that would have special importance just 3 years later in LA. So I think that's kind of a fascinating touch to add there. And the other thing I'm thinking about is just Connor's points towards the end in the beginning to try to tie things together of nostalgia and our kind of growing pessimism about culture, right? The fact is that the music is the one sort of saving grace or has a bit more artsiness to it. And yet she still has to listen to it on records before records are in a comeback as we know of it now. The fact that Robert Forster's character points out that the records don't have anything new and she only listens to old music for her. And it made me think as you were talking about that moment or talking about music, Connor, that one thing that is out of date for this, and it begs the question of, do these characters have to be almost early to middle age? We don't really hear contemporary Black music. It's all nostalgic. It's all 70s Black music, actually, which is kind of an interesting touch within the film. And, I don't know fully know what to do with it yet, but I kept thinking about it as you were talking. As for the movie itself, of course, not to go on too long, it's a yes for me. I can't say I would ever vote a yes for a number of other Tarantino movies, but this is definitely in the 706 for me.
And what was your favorite line? I'm assuming it's not that one. Maybe it was. I don't know.
I don't know. I don't really know if I could think of a favorite one on the spot.
All right, that's fine. You can say it at the end with the whatever we say about the pastrami. All right, Connor, you can go.
Okay, just a final thought too. Just the fact that yes, okay, there's the nostalgia, but I just think overall the nostalgia is tinged with longing and melancholy and lost time, and obviously that fits the theme because this movie has a gutter of an ending, right? This answering the phone call as this woman who you could be happy with leaves and just not being able to put down the phone fast enough. You're being too polite. Anyway, it kills me. It's so incredibly intense, that moment. That ending is so perfect. But again, that sense of not being able to take time out, this sense of loss, of not being able to get that time back, of missed opportunities. So there's a desperation in picking out those Delphonics tapes on the same time as it is an authentic human connection. But of course, it's also Pam Grier herself living in the past, and she's also, really anxious about getting old, more anxious than Max Cherry is. Anyway, so I think there's something definitely more to be said there in the movie, but I think we're on the right track. Let's just note again, just the way the writing of this film is incredible in its gestures and its moments and its little subversions. Again, I think the killing of Melanie is one of the most impactful killings I've ever seen in a film. And it still hit me this time because I knew it's coming, but somehow whenever I watch that scene, I still don't know he's going to do it. It still surprises me when he suddenly shoots her. It's just the way the writing works, because it's like, if you say one more thing and then she says, I don't, and she barely says anything. And then that happens to be the one more thing that he counts as the one more thing and then shoots her. And it's just like, okay, we could see this coming, but yet we still can never see this coming. And unbelievable. I guess it's not just writing, but direction and all that. But the writing is incredible.
And real quick, Connor, my favorite bit of the Melanie killing is how immediately afterwards he finds his car and he turns back to her corpse off screen and says, it's right where I said it would be. I've forgotten that's what they were even fighting about. It's a perfect little touch. But anyway.
He's completely distraught. And it's so hideous. You're right. The character is hideous in his way, but so human at the same time. And that's kind of what makes it brutal, is kind of the humanity of that moment, on top of being horrible and violent and not pleasant to witness. Anyway, so this movie is a yes, I think, for all the above mentioned reasons, to the maturity, the sentiment. It's the only, I think, Kill Bill Volume 2 also has a kind of love element, a kind of lost love, failed love. It has that sentimental note that tastes so sweet, bittersweet.
Okay.
And you're waiting for a line, aren't you?
Yes, go for it.
I'll tell you. It's not a line, but it's when, just again, the writing. So when Ordell and Robert De Niro are at Max Cherry's office, and Ordell is meeting with Max Cherry, and he tells Robert De Niro's character Lewis to just go outside, wait in the car, put on some tunes, take the key, press that little button on the key, you'll hear beep boop beep. Just go and do it. And then the immediate next scene is Robert De Niro goes up to the car, presses the button, and the car goes beep boop beep. Somehow that is it's so perfect, because it's just the simple setup payoff. What other movie would bother to do that? But Tarantino knows that small thing is just such a pleasure to see, right? And that's the kind of thing. It's the basic mechanics of writing, setup, payoff. Yeah, he's just so good at that, and it's a bit ostentatious in that moment, but I love that little moment.
And my favorite line, of course, is "Your ass used to be beautiful." So that is good. I'm kind of surprised I got 3 yeses. I thought Anthony was going to be a little more negative. That's what I was counting on. But that's fine. I'm glad I got 3 yeses. I think this movie deserves it. Let's transition into our next segment, where these three will pitch movies to me for us to watch next week. So do you guys know who went least recent?
I think it was Connor.
Mhm.
Okay. There's got to be a better way to say least recent. There's got to be a better term for that. But anyway,
It's
Connor,
fewer recent, Tony.
What? Yeah,
It's fewer
who
recent.
went fewer recent?
People always get that confused. Less and fewer. It's who went fewer recent.
Thank
I'm
you.
very smart. I went to
Thank you,
college.
Kurt.
Who
I
went fewer
appreciate
recent, I
that.
think is correct. Well, I'm pretty confident I'm going to go first. So imagine, if you will, a painting of a 1950s kitchen and also a buxom 1950s housewife. Now superimpose my face onto that 1950s housewife working in the kitchen, working over some dish. And this is a tasty stew that I have created, or picked, I should say, with the right ingredients just perfectly to go directly to Tony's heart. This is a movie that just screams Tony. It's a bit of a lesser known dish, but one he's going to love. I'm talking about 1982. I hope he hasn't seen it. 1982, William Friedkin's Sorcerer, from the maker of The Exorcist. A bit of a cult film, kind of thriller suspense film. about four men who are all kind of on the run from their past, these dark, mysterious men who find their way to an oil drilling town in Nicaragua, I believe, or I think it's some Central American country. I think it's not said exactly. I believe it's filmed in Nicaragua, where they are sent on a suicide mission to blow up a flaming oil well by transporting two trucks full of aging nitroglycerin, which is primed to explode at any moment. And yeah, as you can imagine, this is mostly about the suspense. It's a grueling journey through the jungle as they try to make it to this flaming oil well to blow it up. It's sort of a desperate act of desperate men who have nowhere else to turn. This is a movie all about consequences, about encroaching doom. And it has an amazing thumping 80s synth score by Tangerine Dream. And it's just the perfect movie for Tony. We'll see if I can get it in, but if he does choose it, he's in for a treat. And that's
I think someone made a movie out of the dream I had 5 years ago. No, I'm kidding. All right, let's do. Or wait, no. Who do you care who goes next, Connor? Or does it not matter?
Let's have Kirk go next.
All right. Well, thank you for that visual, Connor. The Leave It to Beaver with your face. I really, Mrs. Cleaver, I really appreciate that. As if I don't have a hard enough time sleeping, but it's really great. Also, for onanistic reasons, I appreciate it. Wink, wink. So, Tony. Anyways, this film is not as totally catered to Tony. It's kind of in the middle. Like I see you guys on in a quadrants right now. It's kind of in the middle, maybe a little away from Connor. It's a film I may have recommended, but if I did, it was like 4 years ago. So very early on in the podcast. It's called Two Lovers, 2008, starring Joaquin Phoenix, Gwyneth Paltrow, directed and written by James Gray, director of Ad Astra, as well as other. I think he did We Own the Night, which I actually love. I might recommend that later. Anyways, Two Lovers, drama about this man, 30-something, kind of sad sack living in Sheepshead Bay with his parents who own a dry cleaning business. I believe they're Jewish, I want to say, and there's like some arrangement made with a family they're friends with for him to marry a girl of a prominent business. So it's like he has restrictive parents, right? Like kind of who are dominating his life. He suffering from mental health issues, along with kind of this arrested development, as it were. He meets a woman who works in the city and is very attractive, and Gwyneth Paltrow, who lives in the building. She's very alluring to him and represents this kind of escape. And things just kind of go from there. There's these elements where it's almost like Rupert Pupkin-esque, where, it's cringeworthy, what he's doing and kind of the fanciful tale he's weaving. And at the same time, it's, you go down in these lows with him. You're in a club in the meatpacking district, but at this, in the next scene, he's contemplating jumping off the pier at Brighton Beach or something. It's really thematic, really engaging, engrossing, and heart-wrenching, I guess is a nice way to sum it up. But and the ending is something else, I will say. And it's a New York film. I think, we all enjoy those types of films. It's right before Joaquin Phoenix had his kind of implosion with Casey Affleck. I forget what that documentary was called, but it's an interesting time for Mr. Phoenix, and just a good movie that's very nuanced and is, I think, we can all appreciate, and it seemed like we all latched on to the romantic elements portrayed in Jackie Brown. So maybe it's time for kind of this, like a very serious romance. Like let's take a look.
Thank you, Kirk. And Anthony?
All right. I think I somewhat agree, Kirk. It's time we take on romance, but it's time we take it on in a different way. I'm going to nominate someone and their film, someone who I'm actually really surprised I haven't nominated before. At least I don't remember if I have. Someone that Tarantino himself calls one of the most exciting directors still working. And that is my boy, Pedro Almodovar. And there may be movies that are more suited to Tony, but I'm going to nominate one of my favorite, which is A Woman on a Verge of a Nervous Breakdown. It's one of his black comedies from the late 80s, when he's kind of entering his kind of commercial slash still kind of offbeat, dark humored, controversial era of his filmmaking. But it's a movie about a woman who essentially just one day finds out her like partner has just left her without knowing why, and she begins this sort of road trip odyssey with a number of other women, and most famously Antonio Banderas, to kind of understand why. Along the way, there's quite humorous, hilarious, dark moments that involve terrorist cells, murder, gazpacho soup and poison, all sorts of ingredients that make up an Anthony film that I think all of us would enjoy. And it's high time we do a Pedro Almodovar, I think.
All right. We have 3 tasty morsels on the tray. Which one will I eat? So, all right, guys, why don't we do a round of rebuttals in the same order? So let's start with Connor.
Well, I'm fanning the steam off of my stew. I'm hoping that it will waft its way over to entice Tony, like swirl around his nostrils. He'll breathe it in. What can I say about this dish I've selected? It has the meaty notes of suspense and drama. It has also, I think for Anthony, it has a slight spice of political commentary that is not the primary note, but it's there. For Kirk, it has elements of character study. It has insight, though I don't think these are the main things. Of course, at the end of the day, as the premise would tell you, it's all about the suspense of a truck full of dynamite going over this mountainous jungle region, also over rickety bridges and this kind of thing. And the whole thing is just soaked in this grim sort of testosterone fueled darkness that I think it may not be the thing you're in the mood for. It's definitely a very sharp contrast to Jackie Brown, not very dialogue heavy at all. But just a really cool film, many cinematic things to remark upon. You know, again, I'm talking about kind of a cult film here. There's a reason maybe it's a little bit cult, but I have no doubt that you'll respond to it. Tony in particular, I think we'll all have other things to say. It's a critique. It'll be a conversation. It's not a shoe-in, I don't think, but I would be really curious to introduce it to you guys so we could have a nice discussion about it. And frankly, I just don't have much to say to the other films. Almodovar, I'm curious about exploring his filmography. And Kirk, I actually forgot what yours was. Could you say the title of yours again?
Sorcerer 2.
Sorcerer 2. Okay, cool. Actually, wait a minute.
Two lovers.
Okay, thank you. I'm also intrigued by that.
Great. All right. And Kirk?
All right. Well, I will say that Connor's film is actually called Philosopher in England. And, I wasn't a big fan of Chamber of Secrets, but I think the first one has that kind of that new car smell. So could be good. Anthony's film, I've never spoken Spanish on this podcast. If you want to hear if you want to skip this part, feel free. Mueres al borde de un ataque de nervios. I think that's the title. That's the original title. So, it sounds intriguing. It sounds like something from kind of a subgenre or a world, a circle in cinema that I'm unfamiliar with. So that's intriguing, right? Like, what is this? What's there? Are there other branches I can follow, other paths I can traverse down? And so it's completely new to me, and it intrigues me in that way. As for my film, it's just kind of like, what are you in the mood for, Tony? Like we've kind of presented this kind of nice charcuterie board for you, and Connor has the Jimmy Dean's mini sausages, and Anthony has the chorizo, and I've put out the very the A5 Wagyu in the Joaquin Phoenix.
Why mini sausages, Kirk?
I don't know. I don't know. but they're cheese stuffed, so that's good. But no,
You're trying to pitch yours over his, Kirk. You're making a big mistake.
It's what you're in the mood for. There's some kind of this gritty realism, this forlorn element that I know you really enjoy, Tony. You probably have seen this film already, but it's worth a discussion. And anytime we can have kind of a meta conversation about someone within one of these films and how their career and their life parallels with the film itself, I think is very fascinating. So that would be my recommendation for that.
All right, Anthony, close us out.
All right. I think first, flawless Spanish as always, Kirk. It's perfect. As for your movie, I'm a subscriber and huge fan of Goop, so I'll be excited to watch anything with Gwyneth Paltrow. I think Connor's movie is interesting because I've often heard Sorcerer referred to as a sort of one of the movies that kind of brought into effect the end of the 70s, the end of kind of the directors having control, that this was a guy on top of the world after The Exorcist and helped bring that sort of system down. That's kind of interesting to me about like why I would want to watch it. But Connor makes an interesting case. Kirk made a great case for his movie. I'm always fascinated by the sort of simple drama, I guess, of everyday life, of course. And I know it was Joaquin Phoenix's last movie before, or the movie that was supposed to be his last movie when he was doing the Casey Affleck faux documentary, I guess, which is an interesting time capsule note to bring up. Pedro Almodovar, of course, is kind of a key figure, I guess, in world cinema. He's sort of parallel to the John Waters for very similar reasons. You could probably have a 1A, 1B argument about which one's more important to film. My money personally would be on Almodovar just because I love his movies and I've loved so much of it. If this movie doesn't get picked, a number of his other movies will probably come into my nominations. But as for Woman on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown, I just think it's kind of a different movie. It's interesting. It may not be the most controversial for Tony to get behind, but it's something to consider. So all in there.
So I've seen none of these, which is nice. Nice to mix it up. So A Sorcerer's Apprentice, I mean, Nicolas Cage, I have mixed feelings on his movies. He's probably my favorite actor, but he's made some duds over the years, so I'm not sure about it. Joker, I mean, guys, we don't want to inspire a mass shooting with our podcast, okay? Like, America barely survived the spate of mass shootings inspired by Todd Phillips' Joker, and us doing an episode on it will just bring on a second wave. I'm not sure how I feel about that. And then A Woman Under the Influence, I'm pretty sure we did an episode on that earlier, and I think I said at the time that Gina Rowland's portrayal of a mentally ill woman was profoundly offensive. So I'm really at a loss for words here. But I think I will have to go with A Sorcerer's Apprentice just because Connor knows my taste and he made a very strong argument. He came out very strong for it. He hoodwinked me. He deceived me. I am Beaumont getting into the trunk of the car now. So yeah, we'll see. We'll see what happens now. But
get your bib on, Tony. You're about to have a feast.
I'm very excited. I've heard good things about this movie for years. And I even the title excites me. Just Sorcerer. I love that. So I'm excited to see what it's all about. So good choice. And you have any words to close us out, Anthony?
I'll have what she's having.